Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Kyiv and elsewhere in Europe. My name is John Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful panel for you right now, how to build lasting economic resilience in Ukraine, a very important subject in light of Moscow's massive war on Ukraine and its targeting of civilian infrastructure, especially energy, and of course, the prospects of reconstruction and reform. We have a terrific lineup of speakers to discuss this with us today. We have Timothy Ash, who is the Associate Fellow for the Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House and a well-known economist writing on all things relating to economics in Europe and in Ukraine. We have Nick Bias, who's the Group Head of Investor Relations and Corporate Communications at Ferrexpo. We have Ambassador Aaron McKee, who's the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And we have Mikhailo Zhernakov, who's a co-founder and the chair of the board of the De Jure Foundation. So I'll have questions for our panelists, and after we talk for maybe 35 or 40 minutes, we'll turn to audience Q&A. We'll start with Timothy Ash. Tim, thank you for joining us today. I know you follow Ukraine's economy and the status of Western aid closely. From your perspective, what is the view on Ukraine's economy today, and what is needed to spur growth in war conditions, especially given Moscow's massive attack on Ukrainian energy and other civilian infrastructure?
No, thank you for the invitation to speak today. 2 years on, 2 years plus on, Ukraine's economy has shown unbelievable resilience. The fact that last year the economy probably grew 5%. Expectations are that this year the growth will be between 3 and 5%. Also, inflation down to kind of 3%-ish from 25-30 peaked after the full-scale invasion. Reserves are close to 40 billion. Currency is relatively stable. The fact that for the last 2 odd years the economy has functioned. Money's worked, banks have worked. Basic infrastructure, telephone network, trains run better than the UK, although that's not saying very much with respect to the UK. But it has been incredible, and I think the resilience reflects a number of factors. It reflects the fact that Ukraine had some very capable technocrats in key positions, particularly the finance ministry and the central bank. It reflects the reforms that were instigated from 2015 onwards by Gontareva, former central bank governor, also cleaning up the central bank, cleaning up the banking system more generally. So there's domestic reasons why Ukraine's had macro stability. And then also the external one. Unfortunately, Ukraine has run huge budget deficits because of a collapse of revenues, obviously because of the war, and increased spending associated with fighting the war, and the deficit gap monthly is $3.5-4 billion, and it's basically been met through foreign grants and credit. The West, G7 Western allies have filled the financing gap, and that's helped assure macro stability. It's meant that Ukraine has not had to print money to cover the budget deficit. It's meant that there hasn't been hyperinflation and then economic and social political collapse, etc., that would come with that. The stability has meant that it's one thing less for decision makers to have to worry about, right? And that's been pretty positive, pretty encouraging. I guess the continued stability on the macro front and the prospect the economy will continue to grow is still dependent on those financing flows from the West. Obviously, very good news on Saturday with the House approving the 61 billion. A chunk of that is also budget financing. I think around 12 billion of the total is economic financing for Ukraine. And then obviously the European Union approved a 50 billion euro financing package last year, which covers the period to 27. Unfortunately, the numbers are very big. That's the reality. The costs of funding Ukraine in war is about $100 billion a year. If my assumption, given likely reconstruction costs, the damage is $500 billion plus, assuming a 10-year time frame, 50 billion a year. It's probably about $50 billion a year to fund Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. Still a very big ask, right? And I think there are very big uncertainties, particularly about US financing. This 61 billion we'll see surge spending likely before the US presidential elections, or perhaps if Trump wins before a Trump presidency. The doubts, question marks remain, how Ukraine will be funded if we see a political change in the US with the Trump presidency who's less willing to write big checks for Ukraine. I worry that the numbers are very big and the European Union won't be able to step up. Alternatives need to be found. Obviously, there's been a lot of debate. I've written extensively about the use of immobilized Russian assets. I think there's no alternative to the use of immobilized Russian assets. I think there's a great big lobby against it. The arguments are very weak in my mind. We just need to get it done. And I think, interestingly, a couple of things. One is, I think Kurt Volker wrote a great piece today, or this last couple of days, post the 61 billion. And his argument was, we need to, and I guess the question is, what investors want to see for Ukraine. I mean, they want to see victory, right? And I think the West needs to think seriously, not just about sustaining Ukraine, but how we can bring this war to an end as quickly as possible with a Ukrainian victory. And the other, and Kurt, I think, lays out some really interesting arguments how we should do that. The other argument is, the other point was made by Timothy Schneider over the weekend. Again, the argument that we shouldn't be afraid of a Russian defeat, right? And actually, a Russian defeat, the only way Russia is actually going to reform is if it's defeated in Ukraine. And actually, the best way to ensure change in Russia is to ensure Ukraine's victory, because a successful democratic Ukraine sends the best signal possible for Russians about what their country could be too. So from an investor perspective, the macro stability is really important, but it depends on Western financing. I don't think that's assured over the longer term. We have to fill the gap. Frozen Russian assets is the only kind of solution, but investors want to see victory and security. And I think that means we need to be more ambitious from the West in terms of ensuring Ukrainian victory. So I think your mute is on, possibly.
Yes, yeah, now I just fixed it. Okay, I want to follow up a little bit on the frozen Russian assets. As you pointed out, there are institutional arguments against this, but the United States seems to be moving in the direction of actually looking at transferring those assets to Ukraine. We know that Canada is also forward-leaning, and so is the UK. Where do you see the principal objections to this, and from whom?
Well, you mentioned, the repo bill over the weekend suggested that certainly the House is supportive of the freezing and seizing and allocation of those assets to Ukraine. Unfortunately, the bulk of the assets are not in the UK, Canada, or the US. They are in Europe, and particularly in Belgium. There's an institutional block. I don't think the legal arguments are very weak. Actually, in the end, it's a political decision. Politicians make laws. In the US, you've got executive authority. Ukraine's victory and its financing should be a national security priority. If the defeat of Russia is that national security priority, laws need to be changed. The arguments, I guess, the problems are a fewfold. One is there's this defense, I think, from Belgium about the reserve currency argument, right? That moving from immobilization to freezing damages the perception of the euro as a reserve currency. Other authoritarian regimes will pull their assets out of euro as a jurisdiction. That will destabilize the euro. Actually, the assets have already, in effect, been put beyond Russia's use in immobilization. And our messaging has been already clear. Russia is never going to get the assets back while it remains in Ukraine. So the message to other authoritarian regimes has already been sent, and there is no evidence at all about a movement of assets from other authoritarian regimes from the euro, from the dollar. Zero evidence of that. So, and I would argue, if we don't do it, if we don't transfer the assets, the risks to Europe in terms of increased military spending, migrant flows from Ukraine, political stability, that's a huge blow for the euro itself in terms of confidence. Another argument is that about stranded Western assets in Russia, essentially, that we should be really careful about seizing and allocating to Ukraine, because Russia will do the same. It's already doing it. It's already seizing Western assets in Russia. And actually, to be honest, should we be surrogating or subordinating, I should say, Western national security interests to the interests of Western business that made wrong investment calls by investing in Russia in the first place, right? So the arguments are very weak. In the end, I think there's bureaucratic inertia. Needs must. If those arguing against the use of immobilized Russian assets to support Ukraine, they need to come up with the numbers and the figures. How are they going to fund Ukraine if we don't use immobilized Russian assets? And actually, the numbers in my mind, as presented by the IMF, actually in its program for 27, do not add up in terms of budget, balance of payments, and the overall military finance requirement. This $100 billion a year in war, I don't think we have sufficient assurance that, as is, the West has provided adequate assurance.
Thank you. You make a compelling case. Okay, Mr. Bias, you are the head of investor relations and corporate communications at Ferrexpo, a mining and iron exporting company that operates out of central Ukraine. How has Moscow's full-scale war affected your business?
John, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Since the full-scale invasion, our business has changed dramatically. I think we can divide it into three phases, if you will. Of course, there was the immediate aftermath of the invasion. We had to deal with a lot of people passing through central Ukraine. We had to feed them, house them, provide them medicine. We also had to look after our workers and our employees. Their safety is our main priority. Through that year, we also witnessed a lot of interruptions to power. We saw that our supply chains broke down, and critically, we lost access to the Ukrainian Black Sea ports. That forced us into a second phase, which I'd say was about right-sizing the business. We used to export 12 million tons of iron ore products around the world. And suddenly, without access to those ports, we were very much limited to the rail access we had through the Western borders, only to premium European customers. So our business shrank by from 12 million to 4 million tons. Also, we noticed that things changed in the communities and with our workers. That immediate need for food, shelter, and housing shifted. We saw a lot of our workers conscripted. We saw the need for psychological and mental support. We saw the need to change our working conditions. But by right-sizing the business, we've managed to sustain ourselves through the war. And it's very pleasing now to see that we've entered into almost like a third phase. With the reopening of the Black Sea ports, we've been able to expand production because we now have capacity to export. This has been a boon for the business, but also a real good morale booster for our employees. But back to the social aspect, we're also noticing new things now. For example, we are managing the complex issue of helping veterans return back to the workplace. They may have physical or mental injuries. They may be challenged to work in places of loud vibration or noise. So it's up to us to provide the training, the support that they need to come back to the workplace. But we continue on, we continue to produce, we continue to export, and we continue to employ a full workforce. And I think this is testament to the importance of resilience during the war, not just focusing on what a reconstruction could look like.
Thank you. Assistant Administrator McKee, the U.S. Agency for International Development has worked with Ukraine for decades to provide much-needed economic and development assistance, particularly since the big Russian invasion of 2022. What is your main focus now in Ukraine, and what are your priorities for Ukraine's reconstruction?
Thank you for the question, John, and I'm grateful to you and your colleagues at the Atlantic Council for bringing us together today. And I'm also extraordinarily grateful for your leadership in advocating for support for Ukraine. And first off, I don't think anyone can talk about U.S. assistance to Ukraine and not start, as Timothy already mentioned, by acknowledging the positive action taken in the House over the weekend. Long overdue, but we're glad that there was forward motion. And I know that many of you were active in making the case that assistance is vital to our national security interests. So thank you for that. While we await the Senate action and the president's signature, we're continuing our planning process, and we will be ready to move with alacrity once any final legislation passes. In 2022, Ukraine's economy contracted by approximately 30% following Russia's full-scale invasion. But in 2023, and Timothy also mentioned this as well, the GDP grew by nearly 5%. And the IMF reported the country had benefited from a stronger than expected recovery and steadfast reform momentum. And so we aim to support this continued recovery. Our programming is focused on winning the war and winning the future. And so this means that we are simultaneously working with Ukraine to focus on immediate needs and building towards the future that Ukrainians envision for themselves, a country that is independent, democratic, prosperous, and integrated into Euro-Atlantic institutions. This future depends not just on Ukraine's battlefield victory and continued progress on anti-corruption, institutional and revenue generating reforms is essential as well. Let me just give you a couple of lines of effort to actually answer the question. First, USAID has been the lead US government agency providing direct budget support to Ukraine. The United States and USAID have signed over $22.9 billion to ensure that vital social services such as healthcare, education continue while the government of Ukraine focuses on the fight. This means that, with the budget offset, as we talked about, the numbers of continuing to keep Ukraine in the fight. And of course, we all want the fight to end. But in the meantime, we need first responders. We need to make sure that there's personal protective equipment for the energy sector and those that go and immediately both put out the fires and try and repair what Putin has damaged through their wanton attacks on the civilian grid. Second, and I would actually say almost most importantly, so that we can reduce that dependency on macroeconomic support from the donor community, is to support Ukraine's economic resiliency. This is the focus of our assistance efforts, to ensure that we can help strengthen Ukraine's economic growth, even amidst the war. In this vein, obviously, agriculture plays a predominant role, agricultural production and exports. And this is important not just for the Ukrainian economy, but frankly, for global food security. And despite the war, agriculture remains a key driver of Ukraine's economy, generating over 60% of the country's commodity export revenue and around 10% of GDP, as well as 17% of employment. So this sector is vital, again, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world. And as we've been supporting Ukraine's agricultural sector, our investments in Ukraine's ability to move goods by land and sea, as Nick, you mentioned, with the reopening of the ports, despite Putin's departure from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we've seen remarkable both resilience as well as continued movement, sort of all of the above. And so in addition to exporting agricultural goods, which have been now steady, we are seeing, as you know, exports of ore and minerals and other vital revenue generating commodities. Third, and I think this is really important for the entire economic, both resilience as well as keeping Ukraine in the fight and focused on winning the future, and that is protecting and rebuilding the energy infrastructure. We are investing approximately $1 billion to help ensure that Ukraine's citizens do not go without critical services, and to modernize the entire sector as Ukraine moves towards European integration. This is vital because we know that the energy sector is ground zero for kleptocracy and non-beneficial ownership and other challenges that Ukraine is fighting to change, right? They want to deconstruct or forego the political economy model that they inherited in the Soviet Union, and certainly that Putin wants to reinstate, and we are fighting as hard as we can to help thwart those efforts. And we are also rebuilding and repairing, as I mentioned, not only with first responders and Ukrenergo and the other utility workers, but also with ordering auto transformers and passive protection to make sure that all of the equipment that we deliver, both transmission as well as to a certain extent generation, is protected. The last thing Congress wants to hear is that we've spent the money they've appropriated and it's been blown up again. And so as Russia steps up its attack on the energy grid, we are all in and focused on doing what we can to make sure that the lights stay on, water keeps running, heat keeps flowing when needed, and as we head into summer, the air conditioners are going to come on. So it's no longer winterization, It's about keeping Ukraine's energy and electricity supply moving. Fourth, and I'd like to mention, and it's not for big companies, I think it's what we know here in the United States, and that is small and medium enterprises. Small business constitutes 55% of America's GDP. It's the backbone of any economy. But it's also really important as we stimulate and support both entrepreneurs or maturing businesses that have survived and started thriving despite the war. It helps people restore their own dignity, sense of normalcy, obviously revenue generation, but an opportunity if we are able to enrich and grow sort of the small business, small and medium enterprise opportunities, access to capital, finance, as well as support for business-to-business exchange and expanding, particularly their export markets, for those internally displaced persons and refugees to return back to Ukraine, shows that there's opportunity. And in particular, our area of focus has been in the agricultural, IT, and manufacturing sectors. We've helped in the last year create over 141,000 jobs in those sectors alone, and helped unlock over 165 million in financing.
Thank you. A nice comprehensive answer. All right, Mr. Zhernikov, you're a former judge as well as the co-founder and chair of the board of the De Jure Foundation, and a leading advocate for judicial reform in Ukraine. What role have you and the De Jure Foundation played in championing continued transparency and equitable rule of law?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, everybody. I just want to start by thanking the US and everybody who advocated for and enabled the voting of this crucial bill. And of course, because of the military support, first of all, but not least because of the direct budget support, which is the key to promote reforms and to attach these conditionalities, because this is pretty much the most, if not the only, the most powerful way to promote reforms, the necessary reforms. Now, as De Jure, we develop and advocate for reforms in the judicial sphere. So we're able to the judicial governance bodies, together with our partners, advocated for the creation of the High Anti-Corruption Court, the new selection procedure for the Constitutional Court judges, disciplinary inspectorates, and many others. It mostly lies in the field of judicial integrity, selection of judges, judicial career, because it's still a big issue in Ukraine. Judiciary is still one of the least trusted public institutions, and that's something that we have to change, because it has affects directly the foreign direct investment. Because if you look at the polls that the EBA, the European Business Association, or American Chamber of Commerce, that they conducted, the lack of trust of the judiciary is the main obstacle to foreign direct investment year after year and to doing business. So that is why it's key to the state of the rule of law in the courts is key to foreign direct investment and economic stability of Ukraine, so we can be more capable of fending for ourselves, for being a reliable partner. It's also about reconstruction, because mostly, Mr. Ash raised these figures today. It probably will not come all from the governments, right, from the taxpayers' money. So it should come from the investors. That is why we have to have a good business climate and figure out the rule of law. And not least, it's about security, because the more foreign direct investment, the more the foreign countries and our partners are eager, let's be honest, to be involved in defending it. So it's all key, and that is why we're so much involved in issues of judicial integrity and rule of law and building independent courts. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice, good answer. Okay, Timothy, we are joined today by fellow panelists who focused on various issues relating to Ukraine. What do international investors need to see to boost confidence in continued or new lines of business investment in Ukraine?
Well, as mentioned previously, security. It's key. Security, victory in war, security guarantees. Investors operate in many insecure environments, right? But direction of travel, end game are kind of important. As I mentioned, continued macro stability, that depends on financing assurances from the West. Market access, when I say market access, international capital market access in particular, obviously Ukraine is moving towards negotiations with creditors. Obviously the debt service suspension, which was agreed by both the Paris Club, but also the private sector creditors in 22. For the private sector anyway, it ends in August. Either there'll be an extension, I guess, of the debt service suspension, or there'll be some kind of restructuring agreement. It's important that Ukraine avoids default, I think. That would send a very bad message internationally. Worst case will be, I think, an extension of the debt service suspension on par with what the G7 agreed, which was to the end of the current IMF program. I think the move to quickly agree some kind of restructuring agreement with creditors reflects a Ukrainian desire, as I mentioned, to gain early market access. If you think of Ukraine's recovery needs, I mean, this 500 billion plus cost, the destruction cause, that's World Bank, Kyiv School of Economics calculation, this 50 billion a year reconstruction cost. It's unlikely, again, the Western taxpayers will pay for that. I hope for as Russian assets are used. There will be a need for the private sector, and it's important that Ukraine does have market access. So how the negotiations go with private creditors will determine how quickly I think Ukraine ultimately gets market access. I mean, a couple of other things. I mean, on the reform agenda, the reality is Ukraine was a very difficult business environment before the full-scale invasion. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. Many international investors operating in Ukraine had bad experiences because of rule of law, corruption. All those issues remain and need to be addressed. But what's different, and I think what provides some hope, is that I think finally Ukraine has this EU accession angle. Ukraine, before the invasion, the problems I mentioned with rule of law and corruption, I mean, they were also evident in emerging Europe, in Eastern Europe in the early 90s. And what changed was the countries Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, all those guys, they were given a clear time frame to join the European Union. And that actually, for the countries, it acted as a blueprint for reform. There was no debate about, whether or not reform policies had to be rolled out. Countries just accepted what they needed to do and they got on with it. And I think Ukraine will do that. And I think for business, international business, the prospect that Ukraine will be in the European Union, within the next decade, I think will be a reason in its own right to invest in the country. And finally, I mean, I'm bullish Ukraine when the war ends, because I think of the innovation and resilience that we've seen in the last 2 years. Remarkable country to survive a full-scale Russian invasion, to beat Russia back, to beat Russia to a standstill as is, and the innovation that we've seen in drones and armaments, all those kind of things, makes me optimistic about the long-term future. So I think if you put all those things together, if Ukraine has security with Western backing, if the financing is put in place, if Ukraine has market access, and with EU accession prospect, I think the country has a very good future.
Thank you. Okay. From the standpoint of private capital in Ukraine, what can the West do? What more can the West do? And what can Kyiv do to improve the business environment?
Sorry, was that question to me? I couldn't hear you.
I'll repeat it. What more are you expecting from the West besides aid? How does the Western investment look to you? And what can the government in Kyiv do to spur foreign direct investment?
Listening to the previous two speakers, Michaela and Timothy, we've actually found the answer to that question. Timothy suggested very much that security is what is needed. But I think if we unpack that a little bit more, it's actually security of capital. And if you think about what Michaela said, what do you need for security of capital? You need to know that the rule of law is being adhered to. And that's just not a situation that we have right now. I don't think there's any funding from private investors for reconstruction if they do not believe that the capital that they have already invested or have invested in the country is already secure. I can give you some exact examples. As a publicly listed company on the London Stock Exchange, We have some of the largest institutional shareholders in the US and the UK, many blue chip funds. We also have sovereign wealth funds and thousands of individual investors. But right now, Fair Expo is enduring a campaign of harassment from different government agencies for various cases against us, many of which are very questionable. This has forced us recently to actually take a provision in our final accounts, and from what would have been a profit, has turned into a loss. Now, my institutional investors look at this and they say, what the heck's going on? Since listing, we've invested $3.5 billion. We've more than doubled the business. We can do that again straight after the war ends. So it's a model of corporate governance and foreign direct investment for growth that already exists. But right now, our share price has struggled, and people are asking, why will I keep money in this country now? And certainly, why would I invest it in the future? So I think it does come back to what my fellow panelists said. We need to have security, but in particular, security of capital. And for that, we need to see a strong rule of law.
Thank you. Okay, next questions. Aaron's for you. We've heard a lot of conversations thus far, properly so, on the need for reform, especially in the rule of law. USAID has been a dogged participant, very active during my time as ambassador 20 years ago, from the very beginning of Ukraine's independence. What does it look like now to you?
Thank you, John. And I couldn't agree more with what both Timothy and Nick mentioned. Rule of law and confidence in the future of the country and secure investments and adherence to and upholding contracts and deals is vital. Corruption colors Ukraine's past, but it has no place in the country that Ukraine is fighting for right now. Even after the full-scale invasion, Ukraine rebooted 2 linchpin judicial institutions, the High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges. They launched constitutional court reform and just recently completed a competitive merit-based election process for the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, or NCP, leadership. So we've seen the political will, despite while they're fighting a war, uncertainty about both the macroeconomic and ongoing assistance, et cetera, that they aren't letting up. But despite these successes, continued progress on reforms is essential. Collectively, the US government, Ukrainian civil society, government of Ukraine partners, and the private sector are prioritizing the areas most critical for Ukraine to address corruption risks. And as was also mentioned, with the EU candidacy ahead, it's not that they have to say, oh, well, we'll look at the US model, or we'll look at the UK model, or we'll look at others. The blueprint and what's required is clear. And that is helpful, because now we are all both on the same page and supporting and accelerating not just the passage of reforms, but the implementation, which is much harder than just getting the legislation across the finish line. So we are in this next phase, as we said, back to the economic stability, focusing on key revenue generating and business oriented reforms that are necessary, and the institutions that require some attention. State Customs Service, State Tax Service, the Bureau of Economic Security. These are essential and must include integrity, merit selection of leadership, reattestation of existing staff, etc. And so the confidence and the direction of the reform agenda is clear. Ukraine recognizes that, the government of Ukraine, and is taking steps despite martial law and the other challenges. But we really need to accelerate the implementation of what's been passed and make most visible and known what steps are necessary and what that implementation is looking like for the people of Ukraine, and more importantly, for potential investors. Over.
Thank you. Mihailo, in December of last year, the European Council officially opened a session negotiations for Ukraine to join the EU. Those of us who've been working on Ukrainian reform for decades see the EU membership as perhaps a major vehicle for making sure we see reform in Ukraine, especially in the judicial area. What grade would you give Ukraine so far on its progress towards EU standard judicial and transparency reforms?
Thank you. It's quite hard, actually. We, on one hand, yes, we did tremendous progress. Actually, we did very good progress with what Ambassador McKee just mentioned and other things in judiciary and whatnot. But we also have a long way to go, and it is quite hard to give sort of a uniform mark or number to it, because on one hand, yes, there's parts of the society that did tremendous job. You know, Ukrainian army, 100 out of 5, just keeping the country alive. And then, you know, civil society, the free press, active citizens, our international friends, not least USAID, Atlantic Council, and other US organizations. But on the other hand, we also have these, you know, all sectors of, you know, all judges, their political patrons, and other people who resist the reforms and who would like them to not exist, to backslide, and unfortunately they still have quite a bit of influence on the national policies. So to overcome them, we absolutely crucially need, you know, these conditionalities, these things that are attached to certain things that we need, the direct budget support already mentioned today, and other, you know, the EU integration path. It's just the way, you know, hard reforms are being done in Ukraine in the last 10 years. And that is why, you know, if you want to help Ukraine be strong with the conditions and be strict about their implementation, because I absolutely agree, you know, implementation is very key. And we see with some of these instruments, yes, the sort of the path that were mentioned today, the path and the outline, sort of the framework is there, but sometimes with the instruments that I already mentioned, regarding, you know, EU accession and in the Ukraine plan, I fear there might be not enough to sort of break all of these walls that we need to break. That is why, and sometimes there's this feeling of, you know, it's hard enough in Ukraine, let's not make it tougher or harder. It's a very, sorry, but perverse logic, because if counterintuitively, if you want to help Ukraine now be strict about crucial reforms, that's the message I want to convey. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've already spent 40 minutes and we need to get to audience questions. So I'm going to ask you to limit your answers to the following questions to 2 minutes. So Tim, for you, if you were advising President Zelensky on what to do next to boost Ukraine's economy, what recommendations would you offer? 2 minutes.
Well, I do think that Ukraine needs a recovery and reconstruction agency, model on some kind of sovereign wealth fund. I know there is a BlackRock type entity. I think it's not what I'm kind of thinking. There's going to be a huge amount of money, Western assistance going into Ukraine recovery and reconstruction, an agency to coordinate, to partner with foreign investors, to borrow, I think, on its own behalf to fund recovery and reconstruction is kind of what's needed. And it would be a joint agency co-managed by Ukraine and Western donors, ultimately a sovereign debt agency that I think would go over to full Ukrainian ownership, or perhaps when EU accession is achieved. And I think this kind of agency would be an important voice for Western business, right? I mean, because it would have access to, you know, such big financing sources, it would really help to leverage and encourage and foster reform in the country. It would be, a voice for reform in the country.
You're muted.
Okay. Nick, 2 minutes. There are various restrictions on Ukraine's ability to trade, not just Russian military operations in the Black Sea, but also Central European neighbors. Are there any changes in U.S. policy that could help with these bottlenecks?
I think that's a really good question, because I was going to compliment what Timothy just said, and I very much believe that trade is always the precursor to politics. And getting trade out of Ukraine now, particularly into Europe, is possibly the biggest way that we're going to see Ukraine enter into Europe. To answer your question directly, No, not at all. I think a lot of the conversation in Ukraine about accession to Europe is a bit like Mikhailo mentioned, is quite negative. And I hear comments like, are we worthy? Are we good enough? We have so much to do, we'll never get through it. But actually, the trade is already happening now. We supply high-end steel customers in Eastern and Western Germany. That steel goes on to become luxury cars, construction, high-end steel applications. This is already happening now. We already conform with CBAM. We already conform with different legislation in those countries. It's an example of trade that is already working. And the long-term goal here, well, our products lower CO2 in steel making. As Europe moves to a lower carbon, a zero carbon steel future, it is going to need more of these products from countries like Ukraine. So actually, we are helping the EU with its objectives. I think this is a reversal of that whole debate. Are we good enough? Here we have an example of a Ukrainian business that is operating today and is actually helping Europe. So yes and no to your question, John. Thank you. You're on mute again, sir.
Aaron, what is Ukraine doing? Excuse me, what is USAID doing to help Ukraine with its recovery at the regional and local levels?
So here is where economic prosperity and good governance and the felt change or dismantling of the climate of corruption takes place. And that's through one of our biggest and most successful, impactful reforms that Ukraine has undertaken in the past 10 years, and that's decentralization. It's at the local level with local government in the communities that recovery and reconstruction is going to take place. It's where economic activity takes place. It's where people first start to restore their sense of normalcy, et cetera. And so we are working at the national, oblast or provincial level, as well as at the local level, with private sector and civil society to stimulate locally led economic development, improve public service delivery, promote transparent financial management, increase local revenue, and strengthen accountability in the recovery process. So it's not all at the national level. Yes, legislation needs to be passed. Yes, we need that commitment for the entire country, but where implementation, action, and opportunity is really taking place is at the local level. And the Big Bang decentralization after the Revolution of Dignity has given us that platform.
Thank you. Nice and brief. Finally, Mikhailo, what reforms do you think Kyiv should prioritize first?
The Supreme Court. There's so many things, and I absolutely agree with Ambassador McKee, that the Bureau of Economic Security and others, and then rule of law, the bar, the prosecution. There's so many priorities, but it all boils down when, if we're discussing rule of law, it all boils down to the Supreme Court, which is now sort of an elephant in the room, because definitely people here familiar with the $2.7 million bribe in one of the cases that was for this president of the Supreme Court that was, that kind of shows how there was a recent scandal, how good our anti-corruption institutions work because they found it, but at the same time how poor the situation is with the Supreme Court. So we absolutely have to tackle it if we want to be, fair, and if we want to achieve rule of law, we have to deal with it. Thank you.
Terrific. We'll now turn to audience questions. We have a question from Maria Dmitrieva, and I think I'll give this one to you, Aaron. How do we make sure women are included in the setting of priorities, decision-making, and implementation of decisions, especially women from different marginalized groups, which are traditionally excluded from these processes, rural women, women with disabilities?
Thank you so much for that question. And it has been a top priority of ours, since the full-scale reinvasion, but since our significant growth of work since the Revolution of Dignity. And, the most vulnerable and marginalized populations are the ones that need that representation the most, right? Because that differentiation, back to what I was saying about local level development, good governance, and those transactions, is at the community level. And when I say community, I mean all members of the community. So inclusive economic development, particularly with gender-based budgeting, looking at women's role. And we know in post-conflict, under the tenets of women, peace, and security, no conflict will fully be resolved if women aren't part of both peacemaking and post-recovery process. And so this is front and center and a key element and fundamental to the work that we're doing. And I would just add that about a year and a half ago, when we're trying to get out the gray, and they were like, we don't have any truck drivers. And I said, women can drive trucks. And we started working on looking at capacity and skill development across the entire Ukrainian society, not just the men. And so both in terms of response and the urgency as well as long-term recovery, this is a top priority of ours. Thank you for asking.
Follow-up question on this subject, Erin. Do you see the Ukrainian government as a clear partner as you work on these questions?
Absolutely. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing from the GOU right now is what we see across the board, and I'm sure my private sector colleagues will confirm as well, and that's capacity, right? Not only because of the significant numbers that left Ukraine for valid reasons at the start of the war, but also because the order of magnitude of what we need to do to both rebuild, recover, win the fight, and also win the future is taxing the human capital country. And so, we're looking at upskilling, reskilling, and making sure that the GOU has the capability and capacity that they need to be able to plan and communicate and work with donors on a level playing field, both in the private sector, but as you asked, in the government. And so this is a challenge. They keep accusing all the donors of taking all the good people. So it's a pretty thin slate, and we are laser focused on what we can do to help build up Ukrainian capability and skills within the country, both for government as well as others, so that they can deliver.
Thank you. Okay. We have a question from Hiroaki Nakanishi, and I think, Tim, this one's for you. Building lasting economic resilience in Ukraine, how would you might want to consider launching an international joint economic cooperation for R&D, manufacturing innovation, especially for use of the perovskite, I'm not certain what that is, solar cell power semiconductor? A rather broad and specific question at the same time. Tim, you might be able to handle this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a bit beyond my scope of my my expertise there. I mean, but just reinforcing the idea that I think really in terms of the economic sphere, there's still I know there's a joint G7 coordination committee, but I think there needs to be much better coordination. And again, I think that, if you go back to the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism, 89, 90, the project to reconstruct emerging Europe was so important, right, that we created the EBRD, the European Reconstruction and Development, right? That sent such a strong signal that this project, the transition from plan to market, is really important. I think a Western G7 Ukrainian project is creating a sovereign wealth fund, whatever, a restructuring, a reconstruction agency, I think would send a really strong signal that the successful recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine is the national priority for Europe and for the West, right? And I think at the moment we're kind of drifting. And I think in general, in terms of coordination, both in terms of military and economy, in terms of Ukraine, we are drifting. I mean, I think we should be absolutely assuring Ukraine's victory. Absolutely. We should be doing everything possible to ensure that victory. And I'm afraid across a lot of fronts, we're pulling our punches, whether it's on munitions or whether it's on financial support for Ukraine, to mobilize Russian assets. We find excuses not to do what we need to do. So I've not really answered the question, but I've given an alternative pitch of something I feel passionate about. I think that's probably okay.
It certainly is okay, and I share your concern about us pulling our punches. But that actually leads to another question. Let's see now. Oh, that's right. This is from Mike Whitfield. Even after the current war ends, how will Ukraine effectively protect its industrial infrastructure from continual, if it happens, long-range Russian attacks. Tim, since you raised the need for us to be bolder, how would you answer this question?
Well, something I wrote last week, and actually Kurt Volker came back with it again, I think this morning or over the last 24 hours. I think in the end, we have to extend a missile defense umbrella over Ukraine. I mean, we have missile defense capability in NATO on Ukraine's borders. It's not beyond, it's not difficult to imagine that Poland or Romania or those Patriot batteries, they have geographical reach. They could shoot down missiles that are approach in Ukrainian airspace, approaching the West, and that would give Ukraine a significant amount of Ukrainian territory, added defense, right? I mean, I don't think this is an offensive action against Russia. This is defending Ukrainian airspace against missile attack, destroying its infrastructure. I mean, let's just not forget this, right? Every successful Russian attack on Ukrainian infrastructure means an extra cost of reconstruction that Ukraine has to bear, and also Western taxpayers. So actually, in stopping that, in preventing that destruction, we're saving our own taxpayers' money, Ukrainian taxpayers' money. And again, ultimately, Russian taxpayers should pay, but at the moment, our governments seem unable to make a decision in that regard. But I think missile defense umbrella, not necessarily located in Ukraine, but an umbrella from within NATO territory seems like a very good idea.
Okay, thank you. We have an anonymous question for Nick. He says, you referred to, there it is, you touched on this. What is the status of Ukraine's work to support its veterans as a component of reconstruction?
So we mentioned earlier, John, it's a very complex issue, and it's one that we're getting to grips with. There is no established perfect formula for what to do. We currently, I think, we currently have 669 members of our workforce serving in the armed forces, so approximately 9%. But since the war started, almost 70 have returned. They return in different states of mind and health. Some of them may have suffered physical injury, others mental, but it's our job to reintegrate them into the workforce. So we've established a range of physical and mental programs to help them with their health. We often see that they're not able to return to the same work function. So we offer retraining into different functions of the business, and they can retrain into any of the vacancies that we have in the business. And sometimes they're not able to return at all. So it's up to us to look after them and their families. But it's very much an evolving space, I would say, right now. And it's not one that any company has a truly perfect established program, but it's definitely something that we and industry with other partners are working on.
Thank you. Okay, we have a comment, but I'll give this to you, Mihailo. It's from A. Manning. Is Ukraine doing enough, or could more be done in fighting corruption? This has always been the Achilles heel of the country. So, Mihailo, over to you.
Thank you very much. We're already done a lot, but we did not do everything yet. So there's so many institutions that have to be built. There's so many judges that have to be, got out of the system. So many judges, new judges hired, also prosecutors, also, all these law enforcement agencies. So we really did a lot of progress, and you could see again how some of the people that were untouchable already behind bars, and that's a great example of how the newly established anti-corruption infrastructure works. But then we have to do much more to get pretty much every institution that has to do with rule of law of the same quality that the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, a specialized anti-corruption prosecution, and the other new institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. A nice, brief, and to the point answer. Okay, we have a question which I'll give first to Aaron, but then to Tim. Which US, UK, and EU grant and FDI programs are accessible to support early stage projects given the war? and this is from Thaddeus Stitzman Wolf. So, Erin, what can be accessed quickly?
So there's a whole swath of different programs and projects to do just that, to help folks not only either enter the market or grow their business or move their business if they're near the front line, et cetera. And we're standing up B2B. We're working closely with the Ministry of Economy, but also with our Legacy Enterprise Fund, which is it's archaic, the Western Newly Independent States Enterprise Fund, that was recapitalized to be able to look at both equity stakes as well as buying down risk, et cetera. So I would strongly encourage you to go to the U.S. Embassy website, connect also with the AmCham and others to see about how to access these programs, as well as some of the capital support programs we have through the Bank of Lviv and others through our sister agency, DFC. It's, you know, there are multiple entry points, so I can't list them all here, but they are available online and would encourage you to explore. Over.
Terrific. Erin addressed this, Kim, from the standpoint of USAID and U.S. government programs. What about in terms of financial, the IFIs, the International Financial Institutions, and other possible vehicles of support?
So the EBRD is partnering with us explicitly on the small and medium enterprise investment opportunities. We are increasing our trade and market diversification efforts and creating more, connecting through to the EU market, et cetera, on the export front. And Nick, I couldn't agree more that trade will be the solution for the future. And so World Bank is a partner of ours and investing significantly in the agriculture sector, of which we're trying to look at more in-country processing as opposed to, so you get higher value-added products versus raw commodities. They will still do both, but this is something that the Ukrainians want and see as an opportunity. So there's big IMF program, but in terms of specific programs that are offering both technical assistance and support, EBRD and the World Bank are our biggest partners. Over.
Thank you. Tim, anything you want to add from the standpoint, again, of the international financial institutions to what might be available quickly for Ukraine's not just reconstruction, but resilience now, rebuilding?
I'm going to pick this, not really my area of expertise.
Okay, good enough. Well, we're actually over time. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a terrific conversation. I'd like to thank all of our audience for tuning in, and we'll be doing more on this subject in the months to come. So thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.